Welcome back, friends. We're at the final week of our journey through debates about violence. And this week, we're going to talk about a very interesting aspect, a slight twist, and that is about the role of corporations in violence, right? To what extent should corporations be allowed to use violence, to perpetuate violence, to buy and sell violence, okay? So I think this is a really interesting debate because it merges these two fields, these two areas, and then two areas that have lots of issues to debate around on their own. Violence, as we have been discussing, is it ever principally justified? The ethical considerations around it, effectiveness, not effectiveness, whether we can use it, cannot use it, and all of those different kind of really tight inherent debates around violence. And then now you throw in a bit of a corporate spin, right? You throw in this corporations, and with corporations, you get on one hand the whole private model, right? You get the private model that benefits the competition, you get diversity, right? You get private funding, you get effectiveness, efficiency, all of those things that you get from private, entities. On the other hand, you also get all the negative aspects of corporations. You get the profit motive, right? That pushes them to do things for their own good and their own value. You get the problems with oversight and with accountability, right? And then in situations where you get the cozying relationship with government, where because of to do with corporate lobbying and all that, they may have too much influence on governments, and because they're all about making profit, they're going to influence the governments to pass legislation that leads them to get more and more profit, right? So it becomes very, very interesting how these aspects of corporations filter into the violence debates about violence, and you can value add a classic debate about violence, like about punishment or about violent movies or whatever, by throwing in the corporate angle, right? And we did this a little bit when we talked about violent music, or music that glorifies violence against women. Because a lot of these musics are produced by companies and by artists who want to be rich, that creates an incentive for them to do more of it, and it creates a resistance towards changing because it's a very successful corporate model, right? And you will have these debates when you look at things that the state usually runs, like, say, prisons, for example, or policing, and the role that companies will play in, say, running prisons or policing, which is something that we actually do see companies doing. States states outsourcing parts of maintaining or running that state to private models, right? So there's the many areas here where the states will the corporations will impact and value add a debate about violence by throwing in the corporate angle, or just within that corporation alone, and that right of that corporation to be able to use violence in either to further the needs of that corporation in terms of marketing it, selling, making money. Does the corporation have this right? Or the corporation to protect themselves using violence, right? If the corporation is a entity on its own, like an individual, and an individual has this right, then maybe corporations have this right too. Okay, so a very interesting debate. Keep in mind the classic arguments about corporations, and think about whether or not these things are justified when it fits, when we start talking about violence. So why is violence similar to another product that the corporation sells, and this other product may be harmful to society or not harmful, but we let corporations do it? Or why is violence different in this situation? And while we allow corporations to do other things, corporations shouldn't be allowed to use violence, and only the state, can be allowed to use violence. Let's look at some examples. So I put up 3 here, right? The first one is about weapons. So these are like arms, guns. And this can be both guns for everyday use, but can also be like tanks or attack planes and all of this other stuff, right? So whether or not these weapons should be produced by governments instead of private companies. Now, I like this debate because I think it's a little bit hard. We're very used to a status quo where private companies do, everything. They produce all the guns you could think of. They produce tanks. They produce, to some maybe not missiles to some extent, but in some situations they actually even do produce missiles. And they produce, so both in terms of like the arms for a country and arms on an individual basis, it's private companies that are producing all of these things. And they also market them, right? So they sell them to individuals. They tell you why this thing is useful for you, but they also make you kind of want it and need it. And every company does this, right? They have to create a need, because without the need, you're not going to buy it, right? So that's how companies sell, like perfumes. They make body odor such a big deal, or they make dark skin a problem, and then they sell you something to change it, right? Companies will highlight the danger of a specific thing and then sell you something to combat it. So fear is a really, really powerful marketing tool. And it's even more problematic when the companies are selling tools that directly combat that fear, and in a sense, by putting fear in other people, and that's weapons, right? So you can talk about how this is dangerous on an individual level, from a private citizen, but also dangerous on a national level, because these companies will urge other countries to buy and sell these things, okay? And then the distinction here is with like the state. The state, you will say, will not market as much as a company, but the state is also in the position where they will face the impacts of these things, right? So if I'm a state, I'm not really want to sell my enemy's weapons. I may not want to sell my too many weapons to individual citizens, because I also need the police to have weapons, right? So it makes sense to have a monopoly on power, right? But then the opposite is the opposite of that idea of the distrust of the state. People who trust private corporations more than they trust the state, and say private corporations provide individuals with these options, and in a mature, free society, people should have these options to protect themselves, and private corporations are going to be far more effective in creating better technology and weapons, and also help other countries defend themselves, right? So that, I think, is a very, very, very rich debate that could work, that would be quite balanced on both sides. Secondly, on private military contractors. So this is also something that we see quite a bit of recently. Using private military, like in Iraq, or using private military. So these can be people you use that to directly support the troops, or people who use to guard convoys and so on and so forth, right? And I think the big issue here is on accountability, okay? Because they're in a war zone, so you need them to be really involved in order to help. It's not really helpful if I'm doing non-combat related stuff, because that's where people really need the difference. But if you're really involved, then you could end up doing things that may be bad. And who's accountable, right? Is it the soldier, or is it the private corporation? So this debate is powerful on one side, because you need them to fill the need. But in order to fill that need, you may end up taking a really big risk, right? And is that risk worth it? Okay, so that's the big clash on that second debate. The third debate is kind of similar to that, but on a like a day-to-day community level. There is a risk, and in order to there's a need, and in order to fill that need, I'm going to take on a risk. I'm going to hire this private company and give them power to use violence. And I'm going to trust them, and if they use the violence properly and correctly and for the right reasons, society becomes better. But what if they don't? Should we allow them to use it? What are the long-term consequences of this, and how does that impact us on a society level? Okay, so I've decided to talk about the third one, because I think that really impacts people on a day-to-day basis, and we'll get into that into more detail right now. Let's do it. Rock and roll. Here we go. This house would ban the use of private security forces to guard residential areas. Now, depending on where you are or your exposure, this may either be common to you or not common to you. It's not very common in a place like Korea, where you have very effective police force, and residential areas tend to be like condominiums. You'll have a private security guard downstairs, the condominium, but other than that, not so much. You have guards, but they tend not to be armed. In some places, like in Malaysia or the Philippines, you have like normal houses or residential areas end up being blocked off, and they're private security that decide whether you can go in or not out of that area. And some of them are armed, some of them are not armed. right? Depending on how much crime exists in that community or in that society. So you can take a broad approach. In principle, it's about whether or not a community has the ability, the right to protect themselves using private security. The more powerful that security, the more freedom that community has. I think that you should say, leave the option open to have them armed, right? Because if they don't have them armed, then the effectiveness of that private security also reduces. Then they really can't do that much. They still have effectiveness, but you can't, you throw stones at people. Not really that effective. Okay? I think the more crime there is in a country, the more effective this solution can be. But it can't be a country where nothing works, right? But it can't be a country where everything works also. So this is not really a debate, I think, about Japan or Korea. More debate about, say, Malaysia or the Philippines and whether or not it is acceptable for that to happen there. So set up in countries like that, right? So the state is functioning, but it's unequal. And the state needs to do a better job. And right now it's not doing the best job possible. But the question is, which approach, which perspective will lead to a better society for everyone? Is it giving communities the ability to create, their own little private security ghettos while crime just increases outside and everywhere else? Or is it about banning this and then working to create a better society together? And that's the perspective that you take on the Gov side, okay? So on the Gov side, I think run a position that the government is most accountable, but also focus on a long-term perspective. And we get to that right now. So these are the three arguments you can run on Gov. The first one is accountability. Secondly, the long-term sustainability. And third thing, perverse incentives. Perverse incentives of those dodgy corporations, right? So firstly, accountability. Talk about why violence is very powerful, right? If I give a security guard a gun, that security guard could end up killing someone. And we want to be really, really careful about the people we give this power to. Now, by creating this framework context where there's a lot of crime and things are really unsafe, you are going to make these people suspicious of everyone, right? Now, unlike a security guard of like a goldsmith or a jewelry, I can tell who should come, who shouldn't come. And when that threat is really clear, then I'm defending the company against that threat. But in a residential area is a lot more vague. How do you decide who should be coming there, who shouldn't be coming there? How do you, decide who is the threat and not is the threat? If someone is drunk or if someone, is just playing the fool or, doing something, are you in the position to attack and kill them? And if you shoot or, break someone's head, doing something, committing violence, are you accountable for that violence, right? Will you be responsible for it versus a police officer, right? So the position we take here is say that the private security guys are not accountable, and if you have this in many places, there's going to be a drop in quality. We need to have police. If you say that even the police are not that accountable, then how accountable are private security going to be? And if you think that private security people can be accountable, then, maybe they should be doing the job of policing. Now, it's different if it's hired by the state. Then the state has the accountability, right? The state is deciding that the state has standards. The state can set these things. And the state can decide whether or not someone meets a standard for safety or not. But how do I know? I'm just a bunch of people living in these houses and we trust someone to do it and maybe they can betray that trust, right? So accountability is super important here. That residential area, that person doesn't have the power to appoint someone and to give them the tools of violence to commit this violence against someone else. Now, what's the difference between someone holding a gun on their own to guard their own self versus, hiring someone else to have that gun? Okay, and I think you can make a distinction here. You can, if you want, draw a really hard line and say the individual shouldn't have this either. And if you do that, it makes your case much clearer, right? So you say only the state has the right to use power because they're the most accountable, they're in the best position to do it. Now, I think it's possible to draw a distinction. If I'm using the gun, then it's my life against someone else's life, and I'm doing that trade-off, right? I'm shooting that person, and then if I don't, then I'm held accountable directly there. But if I'm hiring someone else, I'm trusting that other person to make that judgment call. And I put pressure on that person to defend me. So if that person accidentally shoots someone, that person is acting on my orders. Can that person be responsible? If I am going to hold that person responsible all the time, then that person isn't going to kill someone, right? Which makes that person not very effective. But if I don't hold that person accountable and excuse them whenever they kill someone else, then that person has a kind of license to kill other people, which becomes very, very subjective. Okay, so that you can create a distinction that way if you want, versus, so individuals having guns versus hiring other people and then pushing them to enforce the peace in your area. Right? So that's the first thing on accountability. Now, the second thing is about the effectiveness. So what kind of world is this going to create? And I think this is a kind of powerful argument. So if you say that in the status quo that the police are weak, right, and can't protect you, then in the long run, does this increase the power of the police or this reduce the power of the police, right? And you can argue that it will reduce the power of the police because it makes the police less important. It discourages the wealthy, and it's going to be the wealthy, and this will create a gap between the people who have private security and people who don't, right? It discourages the wealthy from being invested in creating an effective police force because my neighborhood is well guarded. I have police surrounding me. I drive big cars, and I have, bodyguards and all of these things. So the rest of society it's not important because I'm not really being affected by it, right? And what this leads is a worse world for those individuals because they don't have an option. They need the police to protect them. And when other people aren't really caring or helping improve better police, then that doesn't happen. But you also create a more harmful society for everyone. Because when the gap between the rich and the poor are really, really wide, and you don't get effective policing there, then you build a lot of resentment from the people who live terrible lives against these others, right? And they view themselves as an other. So nothing stops me from harming you because you and I have nothing really in common. I feel no obligation to protect your safety or your life, right? But also it helps crime to breed. When society becomes more unequal, then that is a society that is more unsafe and makes everybody unhappy, right? So in the long term, we need to improve and create stronger police and show that this is counterproductive to doing that, right? Lastly, talk about perverse incentives. Now, if I build a lot of, a huge industry providing security, then what I want to do is not really create more security for everyone, right? It's like, if I am selling you medicine and then if no one is sick anymore, then I don't sell any more medicine. Now, sickness is something that is natural, that is going to happen everywhere, that you can't really combat, right? You can't permanently remove. But security is not. Security is a moving thing. So companies, it serves these security companies well to create an environment of threat, right? To create an environment of fear. And the more fear people have, the more likely you are to hire these security companies, right? It's like those companies that want to improve your confidence by selling you products that improve your beauty, smell, color of your skin and all of those things. But first, they have to destroy your confidence and make you feel like you need these products in order to gain confidence. So they need to first make you feel a sense of fear and threat, because otherwise you will never ever hire them, right? So you can show how this will not lead, this is kind of connected to this idea, that it will not lead to one where you will never need these companies anymore, but it will also lead to a greater amount of fear and distrust in society and encourage them to continuously, increase this, because you always need to feel like they're necessary. So it's a little bit of like, paying the mafia for protection money. Who are they protecting you against? Everybody, especially themselves. But what do you do in opposition? Why do we need these guys, right? So in opposition, you be nicer to the companies. You don't think they are the worst things on earth. Heaven, Satan reincarnate. You think that companies are meant to be private actors to improve themselves in society, but companies are not the blame, right? The ones to blame. Companies are reacting to demand. Like if the police did their jobs, if society was safe, right, then you don't need these companies. So if the government wants to get rid of them, the government should get rid of the demand. And if you get rid of the demand, the supply will stop, right? What the government can do is also set standards and regulate, but not ban. So they can say who can do it. They can say how it can be done. What are the limits? What kind of guns they can use? You can talk about cooperation with the police, right? So they must share information with police. They must let the police come in and do all of those things. You can't create a different army or a militia, but you have to work together, right? Now be careful about painting a situation when it's so desperate that the police can't be trusted, because then you can't, cooperate with the police. Okay, so in your context, you do talk about places where there is uneven policing and show how private companies can be helpful. So you can do like a need right now, and then maybe in the long run, we don't need this anymore. There can be a position. Or you can say like there may always be the need for additional security in some areas, right? So it may help the government to balance this load, right? And I'll get to that in a little bit. The stance you can take, I think, is that community-based solutions work best. And here you're not, you want to show, portray the company and private organizations as small, lean actors that can be best responsive to the community. So not like a giant behemoth McDonald's type of thing, but small things that know better what individuals want rather than police officers, which is actually kind of a big behemoth, right? Let's move to arguments. So I've got 3 here. The first one is the right of private citizens and corporations, right, to fulfill the need. And the secondly is about regulation and self-checks, right? So the self-regulation as well as government regulation, how they can and will work. And finally, how this leads to an effective use of resources. So this is your big picture, better for everybody, makes everyone happy and safe argument. First one, the right of private citizens and corporations to fulfill a need. So here is where you talk about the failure of the state, either inherently even to provide basic security services, because if the state made everybody feel safe, then nobody needs this, right? But the state is failing to do these things. But also, maybe the state fails to provide just the kind of diversity and personal protection that everyone wants. If I am really rich and I live in an area, then I'm going to be a much higher target. Level of threats that I'm going to face is much higher than other people. So maybe some people who are rich, who are special attention, need more protection. And in order to do that, should we get the states to do it, or should we get private citizens and corporations to do it, right? And this is the need that you talk about, okay? It can also be a kind of diversity need, based on the area that I live, or the location. And so in order to provide those needs, I get private corporations, right? So the 2 levels of need. One is just like basic safety, when the state is failing. And I think this is the stronger one, right? Because if you cannot guarantee that somebody will be protected, then the state can't stop you from getting it. Okay. And I think here you can also make like a private gun ownership distinction, that it's safer for people than people owning their own guns, because now at least I have a professional, somebody who's trained, and not every single individual in that area is owning guns. Okay. Secondly, talk about regulation and self-check. So if the other side is worried about dodgy people setting up companies and who are, peddling fear and walking around with AK-47s in front of the house, say that, governments will set regulations. It's not going to be everybody can suddenly set up a security company and start, scaring people into providing security. But there will also be self-regulation. I am entrusting individuals with weapons, right? So if these individuals fail, it'll harm me. But I also don't want these individuals to think that my drunken son coming home at night is a robber. So I'm going to choose people with a good track record. I'm going to check their work. I'm going to make sure that they do a good job. Okay, and this again is like a kind of classic argument that you run with private in debates about corporations and the free market, that individuals can choose and that governments can regulate the worst amount of harms. What's interesting here is whether or not violence makes a difference. To some extent it might, because violence is kind of definitive, right? Like if I'm regulating, a company that sells food and you start to get sick, then I can stop it and I can punish them. But with violence, you'll die, right? Although that's still kind of similar with like drugs. And that's why drug companies or drugs products have to go under extensive amount of trials before they are released. Will this situation work that same way? On government side of this debate, you say it's impossible, right, to put trials for these situations or these companies to such an extent. The only thing that you can, when you do it like that, it just becomes like the police force, right? And if it's too hard to do, you're not going to get many of these companies to do it. So you have to kind of lower that standards in order to fulfill that need, because the problem is there is a need, right, in the status quo. There's a demand for it. On op, you say that, maybe the standards are going to be a bit more loose, but we trust people. People don't want to die. People are going to take precautions. People will fire those who slack off. People will, choose the best, and companies will do the same. And there are many companies that provide these services, that provide high levels of training and are willing to, people will pay more, so those companies will get better trained people and so on and so forth. Now, maybe you can get the same kind of argument that happens in private education debates, where private schools that pay more end up sucking teachers from public schools and, the best students from public schools. And that leads to public schools, the quality of public schools being depressed. That could happen here too, where these private security organizations will pull over the best police officers, and these gated communities will bring the richest people and to live in them, which will suppress the taxes or the situation in other housing areas, and also mean that, all the good cops end up doing the private jobs. And this is a gov side argument, and one that op side needs to be aware of. And op side talks about how you can do both of these things. What you need to do is improve the pay of cops to make sure that cops are still keen on doing it. And not everybody wants to live in gated communities. And again, put the onus back on the government. If the government created a safer society, we won't need this, but we need it. God damn it, we need it. And as long as we need it, we will need to pay for these guys, okay? And that's the regulation, plus a few other bonus arguments that I threw in there. Last but not least, talk about how it can be better for the entire society. Okay, and this is your efficient use of resources argument in terms of how to transfer policing. So you want to create a better society for everyone, and better policing for everyone. But some people maybe need more protection than others because they are higher targets of crime. And instead of pushing police over to those people and making other people more vulnerable, get those people to pay for their own private cops, right? If they want 24-hour security, don't call the cops all the time and have a police car patrolling. The police car needs to be in more violent neighborhoods, more, fragile, more sensitive areas. And that works out better, right? So the rich people are still going to pay tax, which will then help everybody's police. And the police can help those areas. And if that works out, crime will be reduced and everybody will be happy, right? So this can be your big picture, how it helps everyone argument. But also talk about then, at the end of the day, though, the real roots of the crime need to be solved. That you need to make sure people don't have an incentive or a necessity to commit these crimes, and then we won't need that much of an impact on policing. Okay? So, here we are in debates about corporations and violence, about the outsourcing, the privatization of violence, of force, of power, of threat, of fear. And I think this is a very interesting area of debate because it brings in classic arguments from another field and throw them into this area. What you need to do is to show why violence is different or special in this context, but also be able to bring in the corporatization of violence, the free market arguments, and why that may be either better in this situation or worse in this situation. Okay, so I hope you've learned quite a bit from this lecture. I have. Enjoy your debates about corporations and violence. Good luck.